Rest now, let your body grow calm, and let the quiet gather around you. In the stillness, we'll drift gently into Plato's quiet vision of the soul and its journey. If you find rest here, subscribe, and a new one will be ready each night. The afternoon light in Athens fell differently in summer, not harsh, but dense, the way warm air holds itself just before it shifts. It was in this kind of light that a young man named Aristocles stood at the edge of a public gathering, somewhere near the agora, and listened to an old man he did not yet know ask a general what courage was. The general had answered confidently. Courage, he said, was standing your ground in battle, not retreating, holding the line. It seemed like a reasonable answer. It was the kind of answer a man of his position would give without much thought, because the question had seemed to require very little. But the old man, barefoot, heavy-set, with a face that people politely described as unusual, had only nodded and asked whether that definition would cover the courage of a soldier who chose to retreat in order to draw the enemy into a trap. The general paused. The crowd shifted. Something small and irrevocable had just begun. Aristocles was young enough then to have a wrestler's build. His family called him by that nickname, Plato, meaning broad, for the width of his shoulders, and the name had stayed. He had been raised with every expectation that he would enter politics, as men of his lineage were expected to do. His family traced its ancestry to Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, and on his mother's side, the connections ran no less distinguished. A life in public service was not an aspiration in his household. It was simply the shape a life like his was supposed to take. But something in the quality of that afternoon, in the old man's voice, in the way the general's confident answer had come undone, so quietly and so completely, something shifted in him. He did not walk away, transformed in the way stories later like to describe. He walked away thinking, which for a mind like his amounted to the same thing. The man asking the questions was Socrates. He was already in his 60s. He had been conducting these conversations in the streets and public spaces of Athens for decades, with potters and poets and politicians and anyone willing to stand still long enough to answer a question. He charged nothing. He wrote nothing down. He claimed, with what seemed like genuine conviction, to know almost nothing himself, only that the unexamined life was not worth living, and that the most dangerous form of ignorance was the kind that did not know it was ignorant. To young Aristocles, this was not immediately a philosophical position. It was a way of being present in the world that he had not yet seen. Socrates questioned not to win, but to find, and the difference between those two purposes was legible in every exchange. When the old man admitted his own confusion, the admission was not performance. When he pressed a question further, it was because he genuinely wanted to know where it led. Aristocles had been around political men all his life, and political men always knew where the argument was going before it started. Socrates seemed, in the most literal sense, to not know, and to find that not knowing interesting rather than embarrassing. The friendship that developed between them over the following years changed the course of more than one life. Plato was perhaps 20 when they met. Socrates was already old. The gap between their ages was wide enough that what passed between them was always something uneven, teacher and student, elder and younger, though Socrates would have refused the first title, and yet the quality of the exchange was one of genuine mutuality, a shared pursuit of questions neither of them could fully answer. Plato had been on his way to a political life. He turned instead towards something harder to name, and in some ways harder to live, a life organized around the pursuit of understanding rather than the accumulation of influence. Athens in those years was a city that had seen too much of itself. The long war with Sparta, the Peloponnesian conflict that had bled through 3 decades, had by its end hollowed out more than a treasury. It had hollowed out the confidence a city needs to believe in its own story. The democratic institutions that Athenians were proud of had, over the course of the war, authorized decisions that history would judge with less pride. The massacre of Milos, the disastrous expedition to Sicily, and after the war ended in defeat, the democracy was briefly suspended and replaced by a narrow oligarchy, a group called the 30 Tyrants, installed under Spartan pressure to govern the defeated city. Among the 30 were men Plato knew personally. 2 were his relatives, Critias and Charmides, and their conduct in office was not a distant political fact for a young man of his background. It was close, visible, and deeply instructive in the worst way. The 30 governed through fear, through informants, through the removal of men who posed a threat to their hold on power. They were not by any measure of political philosophy that a serious mind could construct, governing justly. They were simply governing, and the gap between those two things, between the exercise of power and the doing of justice, was not a gap Plato would ever allow himself to stop noticing. When the democracy was restored, the 30 fell, and Plato for a moment allowed himself to hope that he might still find a way back to political life, that the restored democracy might be something he could work within. What the restored democracy did in 399 BCE was try Socrates on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. It found him guilty, and it sentenced him to death. Plato was not yet 30 years old. He was present for some portion of the proceedings. We know he was at the trial, and what he saw there was the Athenian Democratic Assembly, doing what democratic assemblies were capable of doing when they were animated not by justice, but by resentment, eliminating a man whose questions had made them uncomfortable. The charges against Socrates were real enough in the legal sense, but the underlying movement was not judicial. It was political. It was the crowd's long, slow answer to a man who had spent his life asking the crowd what it actually meant when it spoke of wisdom or piety or virtue, and not accepting its first response. The execution itself, Socrates drinking hemlock in a prison cell as his friends watched, refusing to the end the various opportunities offered to him to escape or soften the verdict, happened somewhere Plato could not reach. He was ill that day, or said to be. What he received was the news, with all its weight and all its stillness. The wisest man he had known was dead, and the mechanism that had killed him was the one his family had expected him to enter and sustain. This did not produce in Plato the immediate turn to philosophy. The turn had already happened years before, in that afternoon of light near the Agora. What the death of Socrates produced was something more like a settling conviction, the kind that arrives not as an argument, but as a recognition that the argument is over. Democracy, oligarchy, tyranny. Plato had watched all 3 from close range, and all 3 had demonstrated the same essential failure. None of them rested on a genuine understanding of justice, which meant none of them were capable of producing it. The problem was not the particular form of government. The problem ran deeper into the question of what political wisdom actually was, and whether anyone in public life had it or even sought it. These were not comfortable questions for a man of his background. They required him to step away from the world he had been built for, at least provisionally, in order to understand it well enough to either return or not return on better terms. What Plato did in the years that followed the death of Socrates was travel, to Megara, to Cyrene, possibly to Egypt, and eventually to southern Italy and Sicily, where he encountered something that struck him with a particular force. In the Greek communities of southern Italy, and especially in Tarentum, there was a living tradition of Pythagorean philosophy, followers of the mathematician and mystic Pythagoras, who had been dead for more than a century, but whose influence had settled into these communities with remarkable depth. The Pythagoreans were unusual among ancient philosophers in the seriousness with which they held certain ideas about the soul. For them, the soul was not simply the animating principle of the body. It was something older than the body, something that moved through multiple lives toward eventual purification, and the path of purification ran through mathematical understanding and philosophical discipline. What Plato found in these conversations, in sun-warmed courtyards, and in the company of men who had organized their lives around these convictions, was not a system he could adopt wholesale. His own thinking was already moving in directions that required more than Pythagorean mathematics could provide. But what he found were certain recognitions. The idea that the soul was not produced by the body and would not end with it. The idea that numbers and mathematical relationships were not human inventions, but structures discovered, structures that existed whether or not anyone was looking at them. The idea that the cosmos had an underlying order that philosophy could approach, and that approach to this order was itself a kind of purification. He carried these ideas home, not as finished conclusions, but as live questions, which is the only way a Platonic idea can be carried, questions that would take decades of dialogue and argument to approach. The process of that approach, and the institution through which it would be conducted, he was already imagining. Before philosophy had schools in anything like a formal sense, it happened in public spaces, in private homes, in the agora, in the wrestling grounds, in the houses of wealthy men willing to host a dinner at which arguments were the entertainment. Socrates had worked entirely in this mode. He carried no institution. He required no building. The conversation was the thing, and any street corner would do for it. But Plato had seen, in the Pythagorean communities of southern Italy, what it might mean to give philosophical inquiry a place, a sustained, protected, ongoing place where the work could deepen over years, rather than being conducted in the urgent, exposed conditions of public disputation. Around 387 BCE, returned to Athens, he walked northwest from the city walls toward a grove sacred to the hero Academus. The land there was shaded by olive trees, and a gymnasium had been built nearby. He had acquired or been given use of the property. The precise arrangement is not entirely clear from what survives, and in that place he began what would become known simply as the Academy. The Academy was not a school in the sense of a building with a schedule, though it eventually had both. It was more like a community of inquiry, a place where people came to study mathematics and philosophy, and the questions that connected them over the course of years at a depth that a public conversation could gesture at but not sustain. Its students included men who would become significant figures in their own right, and also, eventually, a young man from northern Greece named Aristotle, who would stay for nearly 20 years and then leave to build something entirely different. But that was far ahead. In those early years, the Academy was simply the answer to a problem Plato had been thinking about since his 20s, the problem of how genuine philosophical education, education oriented toward truth rather than toward persuasion, toward understanding rather than toward influence, could be made to persist and to deepen rather than dying with the man who conducted it. The contrast that animated this project, and that would structure large portions of Plato's writing, was a contrast he had watched play out in the streets of Athens throughout his youth. On one side stood the sophists, teachers who moved from city to city, charging fees for instruction in rhetoric and argumentation, training young men in the arts of public persuasion. They were accomplished. Some of them were genuinely intelligent, but their product was a kind of facility with language that could be turned toward any end, that was not oriented toward truth in any deep sense, but toward effectiveness. A good sophist could argue either side of any question, and the best of them made no secret of this. The question of which side was actually true was not the point. Against this Plato placed, in dialogue after dialogue, the figure of Socrates conducting what he called elentic inquiry, a questioning method that did not argue for a position, but tested positions for their internal consistency, pressing them until they held, or until they showed their cracks. The Gorgias, which Plato wrote in the years after Socrates' death, stages a direct confrontation between Socrates and the great rhetorician Gorgias, and the argument it makes is essentially this: rhetoric that aims at persuasion, regardless of truth, is not a skill, but a kind of flattery, a way of telling people what they want to hear, rather than what is. The dialogue called the Sophist goes further, characterizing the sophist as someone who deals in images and appearances rather than realities, someone whose entire professional practice consists of making something look like what it is not. These were not merely academic criticisms, they were diagnoses. Plato believed, and his belief was grounded in the specific historical events he had watched, that a city governed by the arts of persuasion rather than the discipline of truth was a city ungoverned in any meaningful sense. The orators won elections, but winning elections was not the same as being wise enough to lead. The crowd responded to flattery, but the crowd's preferences were not the same as what was actually good for the crowd, and so the city drifted from demagogue to demagogue, from popular enthusiasm to popular exhaustion, making decisions that felt right in the moment of the assembly and revealed their wrongness in the years that followed. Plato had watched this happen. He had watched his city make, through its democratic processes, choices that seemed to him not merely mistaken, but structurally mistaken, the kind of mistakes that could only be made by a system with no mechanism for correcting itself, because the mechanism for correction in a democracy was another popular vote, which was subject to the same pressures as the first. The only alternative he could imagine was not another form of politics, at least not immediately. It was a different kind of education, aimed at a different kind of person. Someone trained not in the arts of persuasion, but in the discipline of asking what was actually true, and refusing to stop until the question had been treated with the seriousness it deserved. This was what the academy was for, not to train senators or orators, but to cultivate something harder and rarer, the capacity to genuinely inquire, to hold a question steady under examination, to follow an argument wherever it led, rather than wherever convenience pointed. The dialogues Plato wrote throughout this period, and he went on writing them for decades, were not textbooks or treatises in the conventional sense. They were enactments of the method he believed in. They placed a reader inside a conversation that was actively working, where the conclusions were not announced at the start, and the final positions were sometimes not entirely settled, even at the end. The reader was not expected to extract a doctrine and remember it. The reader was expected to think, to follow the movement of the argument, to notice where it became difficult, to ask what would happen if a different premise were tried. This was, in its way, a radical pedagogical commitment. Most education aims at the transmission of settled knowledge from teacher to student. What Plato was doing in his dialogues was inviting the reader into the experience of unsettlement, the specific productive unsettlement of a question that has been pressed past its easy answer into the territory where honest difficulty begins. Socrates, in these dialogues, is almost always the central figure, questioning, admitting his own confusion, dismantling the confident definitions offered by his interlocutors. Plato himself never appears as a character in the dialogues. He was always the voice behind the voice, shaping the argument from outside, which is its own kind of philosophical humility, or perhaps its own kind of philosophical authority. The dialogues are too carefully constructed to be accidents, but they present themselves as conversations that could go on indefinitely. This invisibility of the author is a feature, not a gap. What Plato built was not a monument to his own thinking. He built a series of sustained philosophical encounters and put them in writing so that generations of readers could enter them and think alongside the voices inside. The Academy gave this work a physical place. The dialogues gave it a form that could travel beyond any single location or generation. The years between the founding of the Academy and the writing of the Phaedrus, the exact sequence of composition is not fully settled, and the scholars who have studied it have not reached full agreement, were years of deepening, of returning to questions he had first approached from one direction and then approaching them from another. The nature of justice, the structure of the soul, the relationship between knowledge and virtue, the question of what kind of city could actually be governed well, and by whom, on what grounds. These were not questions that submitted to resolution. They were questions that rewarded sustained attention, that opened further the more carefully they were examined. Plato kept examining them, decade after decade, with the particular philosophical patience of someone who has decided that a difficult question, honestly engaged, is more valuable than an easy answer falsely held. Athens itself, in these years, was not the Athens of his childhood. The city had survived its defeat and its oligarchic interlude, and had rebuilt something like its democratic character. But the confidence of the 5th century, the Athens that had built the Parthenon, that had produced Aeschylus and Sophocles and Thucydides, that had believed in its own version of excellence as something the world might learn from, that confidence had a different quality in the 4th century. It was more careful, more aware of its own fragility, perhaps more honest for that. Plato worked within this chastened city and built something the city had not asked for and did not immediately understand, a place for the slow, demanding, ongoing practice of philosophical inquiry. The Academy's grove of olive trees, northwest of the walls, held its conversations in shade. The arguments moved from question to question, from the particular to the general, and back again, without urgency and without the pressure of a verdict to be reached before sundown. There is something in this pace that was itself a philosophical position. The sophists worked quickly, brilliantly, on their feet for an audience that needed to be convinced before it moved on to the next thing. Plato's Academy worked slowly, with a community that had committed years rather than hours. The slowness was not a limitation, it was the method. A question needed time to reveal its depth. A student needed years to develop the capacity to hold a difficult question steadily enough to see what it contained. And the questions that would occupy the mature Plato most deeply, the questions about the soul, its structure, its relationship to truth, its capacity for ascent and descent, its possible endurance beyond the body that carries it. These were not questions for a quick exchange in the agora. They needed the kind of sustained philosophical attention that only a sustained philosophical community could provide. He had built that community. He had placed it in a grove of olive trees outside the city walls. He had given it the dialogues as its working texts and the Elentic method as its practice. He had, without quite planning it as a single act, created the institution through which the questions Socrates had lived and died for could be held and continued and pressed further beyond the life of any one man. The grief of losing Socrates did not produce the academy immediately. Between the execution and the grove, there were years of travel and thinking and the slow clarification of what was actually needed. Grief does not build schools in an afternoon. It asks questions for a long time first. And then, if the grief is the right kind, the kind that is also a love, the kind that does not collapse into bitterness, it begins to build, quietly, on available land. In the early evenings, when the light that fell on Athens had turned the color of old bronze, and the shadows under the olive trees stretched long across the ground, the grove at the academy would have been very quiet. The men who gathered there were not there to win arguments. They were there to ask questions they did not already know the answers to, in the company of others willing to do the same, for as long as it took. The grove itself, the old trees, the hero's sacred ground, the smell of dust and leaves in the cooling air, asked nothing of them in return. Plato had built this place not as a monument to anything finished. He had built it as an answer to what was not yet finished, which was everything. Every question Socrates had ever asked was still open. Every certainty the agora had offered had already been tested and had come apart under examination. The work of understanding, of genuinely, carefully, honestly trying to understand what was good and what was true and what the soul was and how a life should be shaped by these questions, was not a project with a completion date. The grove at dusk held this in its stillness. The last of the light worked its way through the leaves at the edge of the canopy, the olive branches moving very slightly in the evening air, and the darkness gathered quietly at the foot of the trees in the way that darkness does when it has nowhere to hurry. Something had begun in this place that was itself a form of response to loss, not a consolation, exactly, but a continuation. The work that Socrates had conducted in the open air of Athens, in the public spaces of a city that ultimately did not want it, had found a place to go. A grove, a school, a sustained and patient practice of the kind of questioning that does not stop when the questioner is gone, because the questions themselves do not stop. Whatever comes from sitting long enough with what you do not understand, whatever the slow philosophy of an old tree's shade can offer a mind still learning to ask rather than to answer, this was what began there. And in the gathering quiet of that first dusk, with the olive trees holding the last amber of the light in their leaves, it was enough simply to have begun. Socrates was standing just outside the Dippolon gate when Phaedrus found him, one hand raised to shade his eyes against the flat afternoon light, looking out toward the road that curved south along the river Ilissus. He was a man who knew every corner of Athens, every stoa, every fountain house, every doorstep where an argument could be started and an afternoon consumed, and he almost never left. The city was his element. The agora, the gymnasium porticos, the long colonnades where merchants and philosophers alike sheltered from the midday heat, these were the territories he moved through daily, stopping whomever seemed willing, asking whatever seemed necessary. Beyond the walls there was countryside, and countryside meant silence, and silence was not where Socrates worked best. He worked best in the friction of the crowd. Phaedrus had been carrying a speech. He had been to hear the orator Lysias that morning, and the speech was still in his hand, rolled into a scroll he held close, under his cloak as though it were something precious, or something slightly contraband. The speech was about love, or rather about the curious case that a non-lover might serve a beloved better than a lover could, the argument being that passion clouds judgment, and only a man free of desire can be trusted to act in another's interest. It was a clever argument. Lysias was always clever. Phaedrus had found it compelling, or at least he had found it interesting, which in the circles he moved in amounted to the same thing. Socrates, hearing about the speech, was interested too. This was not unusual. Socrates was interested in almost everything, provided that what it touched on was the soul, and a speech about love always touched on the soul. So when Phaedrus suggested they walk along the Ilyssus, and he could read it aloud, Socrates agreed, which was unusual, very unusual, because agreeing meant leaving the city, and leaving the city meant walking out through the gate he was already standing beside, past the tombs along the road's edge, and down toward the water that ran shallow and quick between its summer banks. He stood for a moment longer with his hand above his eyes, then he turned and followed. The road from the gate to the river was not long. In the heat of a midsummer afternoon, the dust rose in small pale clouds at each step, and the shade, when they found it, was the shade of plane trees and tall grasses and the occasional wild Agnus castus, whose cut branches smelled of something faintly medicinal. Socrates walked without sandals on ground that was already warming. He was in his 50s or past them, depending on the afternoon, with the broad, settled build of a man who had once been a stonemason and who still carried that density in his frame. He did not hurry. He rarely hurried. Whatever was worth finding at a pace that left room for thought. When they reached the bank of the Ilyssus, he paused at the water's edge. The river was low in summer, clear enough over its stony bed to show the shadows of small fish holding in the current. There was a large plane tree a short distance upstream, its canopy wide and still in the windless air, casting shade over a stretch of grass that was cool enough and flat enough that a man could sit there for an hour without complaint. Socrates looked at it the way a man looks at something that will serve. He removed his sandals, a detail Plato records with the faint air of surprise, appropriate to a philosopher doing something a child might do on a warm day, and sat down with his feet near the water. The grass held the cold of the ground beneath it. The shade was full and even. Phaedrus unrolled his scroll and began. A speech of Lysias was accomplished. Lysias was always accomplished. But listening to it, listening to the argument that cleverness and detachment are what love's object truly needs, that passion is a kind of impairment, that the non-lover with his clear head and steady hand is a better bet than the lover burning with desire. Socrates found something in him that would not agree, not because the argument was poorly made, because the argument was made in the wrong direction. It was moving away from something, and that something, Socrates suspected, was the truth. He began to speak. He spoke first in the manner of Lysias, delivering his own speech in defense of the non-lover, his head covered with his cloak, as though the argument he was making required him to be hidden from himself. And then, before he had finished, he stopped. He uncovered his head. He said that he could not continue in that direction, that something was pulling him back, that he owed a retraction to Eros before he went any further, because to speak against love as though love were only a kind of madness to be escaped was to miss what love at its best actually is, a form of the divine pressing into the world through the only channel the world readily opens, which is the sight of beauty in a living face. What came next was not an argument in the usual sense. It was something different. It was the kind of thing Socrates offered when the problem at hand exceeded what argument alone could carry, when the territory was real enough that it required exploration, and close enough to the sacred that it required careful handling, and strange enough that only an image would reach it. He began to describe what the soul is, and what happens to it. And the image he reached for was a chariot. He said, "Let the soul be likened to a winged chariot, and its charioteer. Let the chariot be drawn by two winged horses. Let one horse be beautiful and good, bred from beautiful and good stock, gentle in its movement, requiring only the charioteer's quiet word to be guided. And let the other horse be its opposite, in every way, coarse, ungainly, hard of hearing, deaf to instruction, responsive only to force. The charioteer holds the reins of both. He is the rational part of the soul, the part that sees and steers and judges where to go. And the two horses are not his enemies, they are his nature. Together, charioteer and horses form a single thing, a soul, one soul, composite and capable and always in motion. Socrates offered this not as a proof. He offered it as what it was, the most fitting image available for something that exceeds the capacity of human language to define precisely, something that can be approached but not quite arrived at, described but not quite held. The soul, he said, is not the kind of thing that yields to a direct definition. It is better caught sideways, in the way a description catches something at the edge of its nature and lets the edges suggest the whole. And so, the chariot, the two horses, the charioteer at the center, holding the reins in both hands, looking upward. The winged horses of the gods are all good. Plato is careful about this. In the retinue of Zeus and Hera and the other immortals, the chariots that process through the outermost heavens are drawn entirely by noble horses, and the charioteers are divine, and the journey they make is easy, in the way that perfection is easy, not effortless, but native, moving as it is made to move, without internal resistance. The difficulty belongs to the souls of mortals. In mortal souls, the chariot is drawn by one horse of each kind, and this mixture is the condition of everything that follows. The mixed team does not travel easily, it travels at cost. The noble horse strains one way, and the dark horse pulls another, and the charioteer in the middle is the mind that has to hold both reins and find a direction that neither horse would reach alone. This is not a problem to be solved. Plato does not present the dark horse as a mistake. He presents it as the given nature of the mortal soul, the part that is turned toward the body and the body's needs and pleasures, the part that sees a beautiful face and wants to press toward it immediately, without waiting, without the mediation of the charioteer's better judgment. The dark horse is not evil, it is powerful, and it is real, and it is part of what the soul is. Without the horses, there is no motion. Without the charioteer, the motion has no direction. And without both horses, even the dark one, even the difficult one, there is no chariot at all. The noble horse moves in a kind of quiet understanding with the charioteer's will. Its neck arches forward and upward, toward the rim of heaven, where the journey is meant to go, and its stride is long and even, not because it has been forced into this rhythm, but because the rhythm is native to it, because this kind of horse was made for this kind of reaching. When the charioteer holds the reins loosely, the noble horse responds to the looseness with steadiness, as though it has already internalized the direction and does not need to be told again. There is a patience in it, not the patience of something resigned, but the patience of something that trusts. The charioteer barely has to hold the rein on this side. The horse is already going where it is meant to go. The dark horse is another matter. The dark horse is large and badly formed, crooked in the way of things that grew without proper tending, its eyes bloodshot, and its ears deaf to the charioteer's voice, or nearly deaf, because it will hear what it wants to hear, and the rest arrives too faint to matter. It is not that the dark horse is without sensation, it is that its sensations run only in the direction of the body, of immediate pleasure, of the pull toward whatever beautiful thing it has spotted below. It moves by lurch and charge rather than by rhythm. When the charioteer tries to speak to it, the words dissolve. When the charioteer tries to pull the rein, the horse resists with the whole weight of its need. And when it sees what it wants, and it sees it quickly, and it wants it deeply, it drops its head and charges before the charioteer has finished deciding. Plato is patient in his description of this. There is no urgency in the way Socrates tells it. The dark horse is not a villain, but a feature, a genuine and permanent feature of the mortal condition, the way the desire is a genuine and permanent feature, rather than an aberration to be removed. The question is not whether the dark horse will lunge. It will lunge. The question is what the charioteer does when it lunges, and what the noble horse does, and what the three of them together, charioteer and two horses, reason and spirit, and appetite, manage to become through the long and difficult practice of a life. Somewhere above all of this, above the lunging and the straining and the charioteer's trembling effort to hold the reins, there is the heavenly circuit. Before souls entered bodies, before the fall into incarnation that Plato describes as a kind of forgetting, a descent from the brightness of what was directly seen into the dimness of what must be remembered or reconstructed. The souls of mortals traveled in procession with the gods through the outer rim of the heavens. Not inside the heavens, but at their edge, at the very boundary where the sky gives way to something beyond sky, a place that has no color the eye has ever seen, and no location that can be pointed to, and is nevertheless where the most real things are. This is the doctrine Plato sets at the heart of the myth, that the soul has been here before, that what it is capable of recognizing, it recognizes not because it is encountering the thing for the first time, but because it saw this thing once, clearly and directly, in its pre-incarnate life. And what passes for perception now is not fresh observation, but imperfect recovery. The soul remembers, or it tries to, the recovering of what was once directly seen, the long, effortful, never quite complete recovery of those pure realities glimpsed above the rim of heaven. This is what Plato is pointing at when he describes the soul in motion, the chariot ascending, the charioteer straining toward the light. The souls that travel well in that celestial procession, that keep their charioteers steady, and their dark horses governed, and their noble horses pulling in long, confident arcs, these souls reach the rim. They see what is there. They see the forms in their pure and unchanging reality. Beauty as it is in itself, justice as it is in itself, knowledge as it is in itself, not filtered through matter or distorted by the limitations of a body or obscured by the noise of physical sensation, but directly as though the membrane between the seeing and the thing seen had been removed entirely. And then they fall, because all mortal souls fall, and they carry the dimming memory of what they saw with them into the lives they are born into, and the whole of philosophy is, in some sense, the attempt to remember. The souls that do not travel well, that are pulled off course by the dark horses lunging, that overturn their chariots or fall behind the procession, or never reach the rim at all before they drop, these souls see less. Some see very little, and what they do not see they cannot remember, and what they cannot remember they cannot reach toward, and the life they live is accordingly less oriented toward what is real and more shaped by the shadows of things, by appearances and pleasures that move and change and never quite satisfy, because they are not, at their root, the thing the soul was made to seek. This is not a moral condemnation. Plato does not present the souls that fall as deserving their fate in any simple sense. The mixture of the mortal soul, two horses, one difficult, makes the journey hard by nature, and the soul that fails the journey does not fail simply through weakness of will. It fails because governing two horses of such different natures is genuinely difficult, and because the heavenly circuit is long, and because the dark horse's appetite is strong, and because the rim of heaven is a long way from the body's comfortable tendency toward the ground. But there are souls that catch a glimpse, not the full vision, not the sustained sight of the forms in their entirety, which belongs to the gods, and perhaps to the most disciplined of philosophers in their best moments. A glimpse, a flash of what is above the rim, seen in the brief instant before the dark horse lurches again, and the charioteer is pulled back, and the procession moves on. And this glimpse, partial, fragmentary, not enough and yet not nothing, is what the rest of the soul's life will be organized around, whether the soul knows it or not. The charioteer sees it, a flooding of light above the rim of heaven, beauty in its pure form, not yet filtered through the face of a beloved or the form of a well-made thing, but beauty as it actually is, unreduced. The wings of the soul surge. This is the image Plato uses for the response of the soul to genuine beauty, not a metaphor for enthusiasm or a symbol of aspiration, but the actual, literal description of what happens to the winged chariot when it comes into proximity with the form of beauty. The wings push against the soul. They begin to grow. They are not fully grown. The fall into incarnation has worn them down, and the dark horse's weight has kept the chariot closer to the earth than the wings were made to carry it. And the growth takes time, but in the moment of the glimpse, something stirs. Something that was folded tight against the soul's back begins very slowly to extend, and then the dark horse lurches. The charioteer is pulled back from the rim. The vision closes. The chariot descends. The glimpse is over before it could be measured or held or examined, and what remains is not the vision, but the memory of the vision, which is already beginning to fade, which will continue to fade, which will eventually become only a warmth at the back of the mind, without a clear source, only the knowledge that something was briefly very near, without the ability to say what it was. This is Plato's account of why beauty, encountered in a beautiful person, produces what it produces. The experience is not simply aesthetic pleasure. It is not the satisfaction of a bodily appetite, though the dark horse will interpret it that way and act accordingly. It is something older and stranger, the soul recognizing, in the beautiful face before it, a trace of the form of beauty it once saw directly above the rim of heaven. The wings feel it, the wings respond. The soul, encountering beauty in the world, is reminded imperfectly, distantly, through several layers of translation of what it was designed to move toward. Socrates is sitting beneath the plane tree on the bank of the Ilissus, with his feet near the water, while he says all of this. The afternoon has not moved much. The shade is still full and even. The river runs the same as it ran when they arrived, clear over its stones, indifferent to arguments about the soul. Phaedrus is listening. He has heard many speeches about love, including the one he has in his scroll, and none of them have moved in this direction. None of them have placed the experience of love inside a myth about the soul's pre-incarnate life and its gradual, difficult return to what it once directly saw. None of them have described beauty as a kind of memory. The two horses and the charioteer move through this account as a single image, not as three separated things. They are always together, always in motion, always in the tension of their different natures. The noble horse reaching upward, a dark horse pulling toward the near, and the bodily and the immediately desired. The charioteer between them, with the reins in both hands, and the heavenly rim ahead, and the question of whether the glimpse, when it comes, will be enough to change the direction of the whole enterprise. They are not symbols exactly, they are an image of a reality, the composite, divided, dynamic, always moving thing that the soul is, rendered in the terms most available to a language that cannot quite contain what it is trying to say. Plato is careful throughout the Phaedrus to signal that even this image is approximate. Socrates offers the chariot myth not as a final account of the soul's nature, but as the most fitting description available to a human speaker, describing something that exceeds the full reach of human language. The soul resembles this, he says, not the soul is this. The image holds something true, without pretending to hold everything true. It is a reaching rather than an arrival, which is perhaps as close as philosophy ever honestly gets to the things it cares most about. The dark horse in the myth charges at the sight of a beloved's face. This is the moment Plato describes with the most vivid and unhurried attention, the charioteer and the noble horse pulling in one direction, the dark horse catching the sight of beauty below and forgetting everything except the desire to reach it, the whole chariot lurching as the dark horse drops its head and charges, and the charioteer hauling back on the rein as hard as the charioteer can haul, and the noble horse leaning away from the charge, and the three of them for a moment, not in procession toward heaven, but locked in a struggle that pulls them all off course. And yet, the charioteer, at the moment the dark horse lunges, has already caught the glimpse. The warmth of the form of beauty has already moved through the wings. The recognition is already there, and the beloved's face, the beautiful face that set the dark horse charging, is not separate from that recognition. It is, in Plato's account, the near and visible occasion of a much older and more distant encounter. The charioteer does not stop loving beauty when the dark horse is pulled back. The charioteer's love for beauty is exactly what holds the rein. The same force that produces the wing's response is the force that governs the dark horse's charge, not by removing the charge, but by directing the whole soul's energy upward rather than downward, toward the form from which the beautiful face draws its beauty, rather than toward the face as merely a face. This is why, for Plato, eros and philosophy are not opposed. The soul that has encountered beauty and been moved by it, even if the movement begins with the dark horse's lunge, has been given something to work with. The wings have begun to stir. The memory is alive. If dim, the charioteer has a direction. The question is whether the charioteer has the skill and the steadiness and the long practice to guide both horses toward what the glimpse was pointing at, to sustain the ascent long enough that the vision above the rim of heaven grows from a flash into something that can be inhabited. None of this happens quickly. The chariot is heavy, the dark horse is strong, the rim of heaven is far from the stony banks of the Ilissus, but the chariot is always in motion, because that is what the soul is, the thing that moves itself, the source of its own motion, incapable of stillness, in the way that water is incapable of being dry. And as long as the chariot is in motion, the charioteer is steering, and as long as the charioteer is steering, there is the possibility of direction, not the certainty of it, not the guarantee that the glimpse will be remembered, or the wings will keep growing, or the dark horse will learn over time to listen, only the possibility, only the open question of what the chariot will do next, and the open fact that the question is not yet answered. There is something the Phaedrus holds that is unusual even among Plato's dialogues, a quality of genuine outdoor openness, of air and water, and the shade of a real tree on a real afternoon, that allows the myth to breathe differently than it would in a schoolroom or a symposium. The setting beside the river is not accidental. Plato places Socrates outside the city because the conversation requires a kind of spaciousness that the city's colonnades do not provide. The soul's story, the pre-incarnate procession, the glimpse of the forms, the fall into bodies, the long effort of return is too large for an interior. It needs the plane tree and the low river and the sound of water over stones to give it the right proportion. Socrates, sitting there with his feet near the water, is a man who has left the city for what may be the only time Plato records in any detail, and what he has done with the space is to offer the most sustained and visionary account of the soul that the Platonic dialogues contain. The chariot myth is not a digression from the Phaedrus's investigation of love and rhetoric and the nature of genuine speech. It is the foundation on which everything else the dialogue says is built. To understand what makes a speech true rather than merely persuasive, Plato has to show what kind of thing the soul is, that it is composite, that it is winged, that it is in motion toward or away from what is real, and that its ascent depends on the charioteer's skill and the noble horse's nature and the long, patient, costly effort to govern what in the dark horse cannot quite be governed, but can, over a long practice and a well-directed life, be somewhat turned toward the light. The image of the chariot moves through the dialogue and out of it and into the long history of the ways this image has been used, returned to, doubted, and returned to again. It is the kind of image that stays, not because it resolves anything. It resolves nothing, really, in the way that a logical argument resolves a contradiction, but because it captures something that other descriptions leave out: the soul's internal division, the soul's permanent motion, the soul's capacity to rise and to fall, and to catch, in the right circumstances, a glimpse of something above the rim that changes the quality of everything that follows. The afternoon along the Ilissus is still. The shade is still. The water is still running the same way it ran when Socrates removed his sandals and found the cool grass and sat down with his feet near the current. The scroll of Lysias is still there, tucked under Phaedrus's arm, the argument for the non-lover still rolled inside it, the argument that passion distorts, and only a clear-headed detachment can serve love's object truly. That argument is not wrong, exactly. Detachment has its uses. Clarity has its uses. But it is pointing at a surface, at the visible behavior of the lover, and missing the interior, the wings beginning to stir, the charioteer holding two reins, the heavenly rim glimpsed for a moment above the noise of the dark horse's desire. Socrates will return to the city before the sun is down. He almost always does. The agora is where he works, the colonnades, the fountain houses. This afternoon on the bank of the Ilissus is a small interruption in a life lived mostly inside the city walls, and he will move back into that life as soon as the conversation is finished, and the conversation is almost finished. But not quite. The chariot is still moving. The glimpse has come and gone. The wings have stirred. The dark horse has been pulled back from its charge, and the charioteer is still there, with both reins in hand, the heavenly rim somewhere ahead, and the ground still close beneath the wheels, and the whole soul still suspended in the space between the fall and the return. Not finished, not resolved, still in motion, still in the altitude that belongs to things that have not yet arrived, but have not stopped ascending, either. The story of the soul, as Plato tells it, through the image of the winged chariot, does not end at the rim of heaven, or in the fall from it. It continues in every encounter with a beautiful face, in every moment when the wings press against the interior of the soul, and something that feels like memory stirs without quite surfacing. in every long and patient effort of the charioteer to hold both reins and steer both horses upward against the consistent pull of the one that wants only to descend. The soul in the Phaedrus is never static. It is always on its way towards something or away from something, always negotiating between the part that remembers the forms and the part that has forgotten them, always carrying in its feathers the residue of a glimpse it cannot quite describe. And the chariot keeps moving. The river moves below it, shallow over its stones, indifferent and clear. The plane tree holds its shade over the bank where two men have been sitting all afternoon with an important question open between them, a question about love and truth and the nature of genuine speech, and whether any of these things are separable from the strange composite, winged, always in motion thing that the soul is. They have not resolved the question. The question is not the kind of thing that resolves in an afternoon beside a river, but it is the kind of thing that opens, that grows in the asking, more capacious and more honest about what it does not know, and it is open now, and it is moving, and somewhere above the rim of the conversation, the wings are still pressing outward, feather by feather, into the high and patient air. Socrates is holding a simple logical rule in the air of the academy, like a man lifting a lamp in a room that has not been lit before. The rule is not complicated. A single thing cannot at the same moment and in the same respect both do and not do the same thing. A man standing cannot also be sitting. A stone moving to the right cannot also be moving to the left. This much seems obvious, almost embarrassingly so, and the students in the room may be wondering why a man of Socrates' reputation is taking such care with something so elementary. Then he turns the rule slowly, holds it at a different angle, and something in the room changes. If the soul desires something and also resists that same desire, then the soul cannot be simple. It cannot be a single undivided thing. Two opposed motions cannot be happening in one place at one time. The rule is not about stones or standing men at all. It has been, from the beginning, a mirror held at an angle, and what it is reflecting is not the world outside, but the world within, the interior of every person sitting in that courtyard, which turns out, under this quiet examination, to be considerably more crowded than most of them had assumed. The argument Plato puts into Socrates' mouth in the Republic is careful and almost deceptively patient. It does not begin with the soul at all. It begins with thirst. A man is thirsty and does not drink. This is ordinary enough. Anyone who has waited before a meal knows the experience. But the ordinary fact, looked at from the right angle, is philosophically strange. Something in the man wants the water. Something else in the man is restraining the wanting. For this to be possible, those two things cannot be the same thing. They are, Plato argues, genuinely distinct, not different descriptions of one unified response, but different parts, each with its own character and its own direction, capable of working at cross purposes within the single life of a single person. The principle of non-contradiction, that quiet tool, has now done something extraordinary. It has divided the soul. What Plato finds there, in the interior that the argument opens up, is not chaos. The parts are three in number, and each has a nature of its own. The first is the part that reasons, that weighs and deliberates and considers long consequences over short ones, that knows the difference between what seems good and what is good, and whose proper place is governance. Plato calls it the logistikon, the calculating or reasoning part, the one that is capable of looking at a desire and asking whether satisfying it is wise. The second part is the one that loves honor, that flares at perceived injustice, that would rather endure discomfort than bear the quiet shame of having acted badly. Plato calls this the thumos, the spirited part, and it is not reason, but it is also not appetite. It is something between them, capable of being an ally to reason or a collaborator with appetite, depending on which way it leans. The third part is the appetitive, the epithumia, which wants things with the directness and persistence of a thirsty root seeking water, food, drink, bodily warmth, pleasures of every kind, and not because it has reasoned its way to wanting them, but because wanting them is simply what it does. These three parts are not an invention Plato arrived at easily. The structure grew through the sustained pressure of argument, and it was not without its difficulties. The most careful philosophers have always found places in the theory to press against. But the structure held well enough to become one of the enduring shapes in the Western understanding of what a self might be, not a unified, transparent thing, but a confederation, sometimes harmonious and sometimes not, and the quality of a life determined in large part by which part is governing and how. The story of Leontius arrives in the Republic as a kind of proof. He is not a famous figure. He is a man whose name would otherwise be entirely forgotten, but Plato sets him down in one of the most precise psychological observations in ancient philosophy, and he stays there, fixed in that moment, illustrating something that argument alone has difficulty making felt. Leontius is walking back toward Athens along the road that passes outside the city walls, near the place where executions are carried out, and the bodies of the condemned are sometimes left. He knows what he is going to pass. He tries not to look. The trying is real. There is a part of him that does not want to see the bodies, that finds the impulse to look shameful, that would rather arrive in the city without having yielded. The struggle goes on for some time, and then it ends, as many struggles do, not in victory, but in sudden capitulation. He tears his eyes toward the sight. He looks, and even as he looks, something inside him rises in fury, not at the bodies, but at himself, at the eyes that would not listen, at the part of him that dragged him toward what he did not want to want. He is reported to have spoken to his own eyes, cursing them for what they have just made him do. Here is the thing that makes Leontius philosophically important. When he curses his eyes, there is a part of him doing the cursing. That part did not want to look. That part is angry in the specific way that someone is angry when they have been let down by something that should have listened and did not. This anger is not reason. Reason merely calculated and concluded that looking was unwise. This anger has a quality of shame and indignation in it, a sense of dignity violated, a refusal to accept without protest that the worst part has won. Plato identifies this anger as the spirited part, the thumos, which in this case is aligned not with appetite, but against it, which means that in a soul not yet fully corrupted, the spirited part tends to stand with reason in the interior conflict. The whole scene is a small drama in three parts, and none of them is the audience. They are all actors, and Leontius is all of them. It is worth sitting with what this implies. The division Plato is describing is not a metaphor for having mixed feelings. It is not a way of saying that people sometimes feel conflicted. The argument is sharper than that. If the soul were truly simple, the conflict Leontius experiences would be impossible. You cannot be pulled in two directions by a single thing. You cannot be both the one who looks and the one who is furious at the looking, unless there are genuinely two, present in the same person, as distinct in their natures as a soldier who wants to charge is distinct from an officer who orders him to hold the line. The soldier and the officer are not the same person using different words. They have different authorities, different orientations, different senses of what matters. Leontius contains both of them, and more, for somewhere in him is also the part that simply wanted to look without any commentary at all. From the three parts, Plato builds a political geography. The Republic is, among other things, a thought experiment about justice, and justice in the city is understood as each class performing its proper function, the rulers ruling, the soldiers defending, the craftsmen and workers producing, with no part overstepping into the territory of another. The analogy to the soul is not decorative. Plato means it structurally. The just soul is the soul in which reason governs. Spiritedness supports and enforces reason's governance, and appetite is given its due, but not more than its due. The unjust soul is not simply a soul that has done something wrong. It is a soul whose interior order has been disrupted, in which one of the lower parts has seized a governance it is not equipped for, and the whole has suffered accordingly. What it looks like when governance fails is something Plato traces with careful attention through what might be called the descent of souls. The well-ordered soul is what he calls the aristocratic soul, not aristocratic in terms of birth or status, but in terms of what rules within it. The best part, the reasoning part, which can see past immediate pleasure toward what is genuinely worth wanting. Below the aristocratic soul, Plato arranges a sequence of declining interior orders, each corresponding to a political constitution and to a type of person. The timocratic soul has let spiritedness grow too strong. It is driven by honor, sensitive to reputation, capable of great courage and loyalty, but not fully at home in the life of pure reason, which it has begun to suspect, without knowing quite why. Below that is the oligarchic soul, in which the love of wealth has taken a kind of quiet precedence, not openly, not loudly, but in the way that interior priorities actually organize a life, deciding what gets attention and what gets ignored. Below that is the democratic soul, in which no preference has any real authority over any other, where every appetite is given equal weight, and the soul becomes, in Plato's image, a city in which every impulse is a citizen, with a vote, and none has been trained to govern. And then there is the tyrannical soul. This is where Plato's psychological observation becomes genuinely arresting. The tyrant in the outer world appears to be the freest of all persons, the one who is constrained by nothing, who can act on every desire without check or consequence. But Plato inverts this picture. Inside the soul of the tyrant is not freedom, but the deepest servitude the soul can experience, because the tyrant is governed by what Plato calls a master passion, a single appetite so large and so persistent that it has consumed every other part of the soul's life. The tyrant does not rule his desires rule him, and unlike a ruler who can be satisfied, who can set down his work for a night and rest, the master passion of the tyrant's soul is by its nature insatiable. To satisfy a desire of this kind is only to feed it, and feeding it only makes it larger. The tyrant is not a free man living without constraint. He is a man chained to something that will never stop pulling, wearing a face that looks, from the outside, like command. Plato is at some pains to make this felt, rather than merely argued. The tyrant's soul is not held up as a monster to be feared, but as a warning about what happens when the interior structure of governance collapses and appetite is left without a counterweight. It is not that the appetitive part is evil by nature. Plato does not argue that. It is that the appetitive part is by nature ungoverned and without limit, and therefore requires governance, the same way any powerful force requires a channel if it is not to become destructive. The problem with the tyrant's soul is not that it has an appetitive part. Every soul does. The problem is that the appetitive part has consumed the space that ought to belong to reason and to the spirited part that supports reason, and the soul has become, in that interior, exactly as chaotic and exhausting and essentially unfree as a city that has been taken over by a mob. One of the virtues Plato returns to with particular care is what he calls sophrosine. The word is often translated as temperance or self-mastery, and both translations carry something of the meaning without quite capturing it whole. Sophrosine is the condition in which the lower parts of the soul consent to be governed, not because they have been crushed or silenced, but because they have been brought through whatever combination of education and practice and philosophical reflection to recognize the fitness of reason's authority. It is not the absence of appetite. A person with sophrosine still gets hungry, still desires things, still has a spirited part that responds to perceived slights or injustices. The difference is that these parts do not overrule, they do not go rogue. They operate within a structure in which they are present and alive, but not sovereign. Plato describes this condition through the image of music, inner music, a harmony of parts. The metaphor is chosen with care. Harmony is not silence. A chord is not one note, but several, each in its own place, each sounding its own frequency. And the harmony is not the elimination of the individual notes, but their right relationship. A soul in the condition of sophrosine is not a soul from which desire has been extinguished. It is a soul in which each part is sounding, and the relationship between the parts has the quality that Plato elsewhere associates with beauty, ordered, proportioned, each element supporting rather than disrupting the others. This harmony is what he identifies with genuine happiness, not pleasure. Pleasure is what the appetitive soul mistakes for happiness, and this mistake is the source of much of what makes lives go wrong. Genuine happiness, for Plato, is the interior state of a soul whose parts are in right relationship, which is a state that has almost nothing to do with how much pleasure the person is experiencing at any given moment, and everything to do with the quality of the governance within. The argument presses further. If happiness is this kind of interior order, then the pursuit of pleasure as a strategy for happiness is not simply naive, it is self-defeating. Every act of yielding to appetite beyond what reason would endorse is not a small reward, but a small disruption of the order that makes genuine well-being possible. The tyrant, who has maximized his access to pleasure and minimized every obstacle to appetite, has by that very strategy made himself the unhappiest person in the city. He is not happy despite his pleasures. He is unhappy because of them, because they have, one by one and then all at once, dismantled the interior structure that alone could have made his life go well. There is a kind of moral psychology here that does not require appeal to consequences, or to what others think, or to any external authority at all. The argument is interior throughout. It is about what the soul is, and what its parts are, and what it means for a thing to be well or badly ordered. A knife is well ordered when it cuts cleanly. A ship is well ordered when it moves safely and purposefully through water. A soul is well ordered when its three parts are in right relationship with reason and governance, and the lower parts appropriately responsive to that governance. This is not an analogy that Plato uses as decoration. It is the center of his account of justice. Justice, both in the city and in the soul, is each part performing its proper function, and injustice is a disorder of this structure that makes the whole thing worse at being what it is. Plato sits at the academy, drawing the outline of the ideal city on a wax tablet, and the moment of recognition if there was such a moment, must have been something like this: the three classes he has been describing, the philosopher rulers, the spirited soldiers, the craftsmen and workers who manage the production of material goods, are not only a political arrangement, they are a map of something already present inside every person in the room, inside every person who has ever experienced the pull of competing parts within the same life. The city is the soul writ large. The soul is the city writ small. The theory of justice in the Republic is a single argument running at two scales simultaneously, and neither scale is merely illustrative of the other. Both are real. Both require the same thing of their constituent parts, that each know its proper place and accept the authority of what is best equipped to govern. The rational part, the logisticon, is best equipped to govern because it alone can see past the present moment. Appetite sees only what it wants, and wants it now. Spiritedness responds to immediate contexts. A perceived slight calls it up. A gesture of respect quiets it. Only reason can consider the long arc of a life, and ask not what satisfies today, but what makes the whole thing good. This is not a claim that reason is free of error. Plato does not argue that a rational soul will always choose correctly. He argues that it is more likely to choose well than appetite or spiritedness would be without it, and that the soul ordered around reason's governance is better positioned to live toward the good than any soul ordered around the other parts. What happens in the Phaedrus is related but differently shaped. The same three-part structure is present: the reasoning part, the spirited part, the appetitive part, but the presentation has shifted from argument to image, and the shift is not accidental. In the Republic, the tripartite soul is established through logical pressure, the principle of non-contradiction, applied until the interior divisions become unavoidable. In the Phaedrus, the same soul is given wings and horses and a charioteer and set in motion across the sky. The same structure, once in the language of argument and once in the language of myth, and both presentations are necessary because the soul Plato is describing exceeds what either mode alone can capture. The charioteer in the Phaedrus is the reasoning part, the logisticon, seen not in a philosophical argument, but in a myth of flight and struggle and longing. The noble horse that moves in alignment with the charioteer's direction corresponds to the spirited part, the thumos, not a problem to be managed but a resource, a living power that, when properly oriented, makes ascent possible. The dark horse, ungainly and resistant, is the appetitive part, pulling earthward, responding not to the charioteer's voice, but to the sight of whatever beautiful thing passes within reach, and requiring considerable effort to bring back into the motion of the whole. The chariot is not a static diagram. It is moving, always moving, and the quality of its motion, whether it rises or falls, whether it maintains the direction the charioteer intends, depends entirely on the ongoing relationship between the three. This is where the Phaedrus adds something to the picture the Republic has drawn. The Republic is fundamentally interested in structure, in the arrangement of the parts, and the question of which part governs and what follows from that. The Phaedrus is fundamentally interested in motion, in the soul's capacity for ascent and descent, for growing wings through the encounter with beauty and love, for falling when appetite overwhelms the charioteer and the dark horse drags the whole chariot earthward. In the Republic, the soul is a political entity, a city with classes and a constitution. In the Phaedrus, the soul is a moving thing, engaged in a journey whose direction is always being determined by the relationship of its parts. It might seem, holding the two accounts side by side, that they are in tension. The Republic's soul is static in its structure, mapped onto the fixed classes of a city, The Phaedrus's soul is dynamic, always in the process of rising or falling, and the journey is described in mythic rather than logical terms. But the tension dissolves when the two are understood as describing the same thing at different moments and for different purposes. The Republic is asking, what is a soul, and what does it look like when it is well ordered? The Phaedrus is asking, what does the soul do, and toward what does it move when the reasoning part is in proper governance? The answer in both cases is the same, a soul in which reason governs, supported by a spiritedness that has been educated toward reason's aims, moves toward what is genuinely good, toward the forms, toward beauty, toward truth, while a soul in which appetite has seized governance sinks toward what merely appears good and mistakes the appearance for the thing. The image of Leontius on the road outside Athens, and the image of the charioteer struggling with the dark horse who has caught sight of a beautiful face, are not different arguments. They are the same moment rendered twice, once in the compressed psychological realism of a story about a man and his eyes, and once in the expansive mythic imagery of a winged vehicle crossing the sky. In both cases, the appetitive part has responded to something visible and beautiful in a way that is not governed by reason. In both cases, another part of the soul registers protest. In both cases, the question is whether the governing part can reassert itself, or whether the pull toward the earth will win. What Plato is building, across both dialogues and through both modes, is a picture of the human interior that takes seriously the genuine multiplicity of what it is to be a person. There is no single unified thing that desires, or reasons, or feels indignation. There are several, and the quality of a life is determined by their relationship. The soul that is well ordered is not the soul that has suppressed everything below reason. It is the soul in which the lower parts have been educated, shaped, habituated, brought into a relationship with the reasoning part that allows them to function without overriding it. The soldiers in the ideal city are not enslaved, they are trained. The dark horse in the chariot is not killed, it is governed, and governing something is not the same as destroying it. A well-governed appetite is still an appetite. It still wants things. It still moves toward what it values. But it does so within a structure that prevents it from taking everything over, and within that structure, something like genuine happiness, which is to say genuine order, becomes possible. The condition of Sophrosyne, held in that image of inner music, is not something achieved once and maintained without effort. Plato knows, and his dialogues make clear, that the interior work of governance is continuous. The dark horse does not stop wanting. Leontius was not a bad man who had never tried. The struggle is the nature of the soul, not a flaw in some souls and absent in others. What distinguishes the philosopher's soul from the tyrant's soul is not that one has appetites and the other does not, but that one has, through sustained effort and the cultivation of reason's authority, arrived at a condition in which the lower parts are governed rather than governing, and that this condition, maintained over a life, produces something that the tyrant's soul, with all its satisfactions, never comes close to producing. Plato is also careful, particularly in the Republic, not to locate happiness anywhere that requires external conditions. The philosopher's soul is well ordered, whether the city rewards it or not. The tyrant's soul is disordered, whether the city praises it or not. The interior is the site of both justice and its opposite, and no amount of external success can compensate for the interior disorder that appetite governance produces, just as no amount of external failure can take from the philosopher's soul the quality that its interior order gives it. This is a strong claim, and Plato means it strongly. the soul that has achieved Sophrosyne, that lives from a center of rational governance with the spirited part aligned and the appetitive part appropriately bounded, is in the condition that he calls eudaimonia, a word often translated as happiness, but better understood as flourishing, as the state of a thing functioning fully and well, in accordance with what it most deeply is. And what the soul most deeply is, for Plato, is the reasoning part, not in the sense that the other parts are somehow not really the soul, but in the sense that the soul's proper function, the function it is fitted for in the same way a knife is fitted for cutting, is the life of reason, the turning toward what is genuinely good rather than what merely appears good. The logistikon is not a better part among equals. It is the part that can know what the soul is for, and therefore the part that, when it governs, allows the whole soul to move in the direction of genuine life, rather than the parody of it that appetite governance produces. Late in the afternoon, when the light across a courtyard begins to go honey-colored and long, there is a quality of stillness that settles before anything has been decided, before the day has become the evening, before the questions of the hour have been answered or abandoned. Plato's philosophy of the soul has something of that quality. It is not finished. The argument does not resolve into a single settled image and hold still. The logistikon continues to reason, the thumos continues to respond, the epithumia continues to want, and the relationship among them continues to be determined by the habits of a life. But the structure is clear, held steady under examination, 3 parts, 1 soul, and the harmony that makes a life genuinely good, dependent on which part is governing and how the others have learned to follow. The inner music that Sophrosyne produces is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is the kind of sound that can be heard only in rooms where the louder things have quieted, not gone, but quieted, held in their proper place. And what the quieting reveals is not silence, but proportion, each voice in its register, none overwhelming the others, all 3 parts of the one soul present and in right relation to one another, and the whole thing held together in that right relation, sounding low and steady and genuinely at rest. Socrates arrived late to the dinner party. This was not unusual. Those who knew him well had learned to leave a space, to pour a cup and wait, because he had a habit of stopping somewhere on the way, in a doorway, at the edge of a colonnaded street, in whatever patch of shade offered itself, and standing there perfectly still, lost inside some thought that had reached out and caught him. The philosopher Aristodemus, who walked with Socrates to the gathering that evening, arrived to find the host already reclining and the couches already arranged, and explained without any particular embarrassment that Socrates had paused somewhere behind him and had not yet arrived. When Socrates did finally come through the door, the guests already into their second cups, the lamps already casting their low and steady light across the faces of the assembled, he settled beside the host as though no time had passed, and looked around at the company with that expression his friends had spent years trying to describe, attentive without being eager, warm without quite arriving, present in the room and also somewhere else. That evening, in the house of Agathon the poet, someone would ask each person present to speak about the nature of Eros. Several did. They offered praise and genealogy and etymology and mythology, each in their own style, each carrying their own understanding of what love was and where it came from and what it wanted. Socrates listened to all of them, and when his turn came, he did not offer his own view. He reported instead what a woman named Diotima had once told him. She was from Mantinea, he said. She had taught him the things of love, and what she had taught him was not what he had expected, because she had not treated Eros as something grand and beautiful and triumphant, which was more or less what everyone else in the room had just finished saying. She had described Eros as something in between, not beautiful, but not ugly, not rich, but not poor, not mortal, but not immortal, always in a state of wanting, always in a state of seeking, and in that perpetual incompleteness, not defeated, but alive in a way that fullness never quite achieves. Eros, she told him, is a daimon, a spirit that moves between the divine and the human, carrying messages, carrying longing, occupying the middle space that neither gods nor mortals can inhabit alone. Socrates was quiet when she said this. His friends who heard him report it that evening noticed that his voice had a quality it did not always have, not the brisk eagerness of the questioner, not the mild irony of the man who claims to know nothing, but something softer and more careful, the voice of a person returning to something they have thought about for a long time and still find inexhaustible. Diotima had not given him an answer. She had given him a picture, and the picture had never stopped moving in him. What she described was not just the nature of Eros, but its direction, not where it comes from, but where it goes, if it is followed with patience and with a guide who knows the way. And the image she used was a ladder, not a violent or sudden ascent, nothing like a leap, but a slow, careful climbing, rung by rung, each step made possible by the last, each new height making the one before it seem like a preparation rather than a destination. The first rung is the one nearly everyone stands on, at least briefly, at least once. A person is arrested by the beauty of a face, not metaphorically arrested, genuinely stopped, genuinely caught, unable to continue in the direction they were going, because something in what they have seen has reached into them and held. Diotima does not dismiss this. She treats it seriously as the beginning of something, because that is what it is. What arrests the person at that moment is not simply a pleasing arrangement of features, or the particular quality of an afternoon's light on particular skin. Something else is shining through, something the beautiful face is not producing but conducting, the way a window conducts light without being the source of it. The wise guide, the teacher who stands beside the person at the bottom of the ladder, asks them to look again, to notice that what draws them is not only this face, but beauty itself, shining through it. And once that much has been seen, the guide asks, if beauty shines through this face, does it not also shine through others? Are there not many beautiful bodies, and is the beauty not the same beauty, appearing in each? The person who has only ever loved one particular face begins, slowly, to see that what they love in that face is larger than any face. The love does not diminish, it expands. It begins to understand its own object. The next rung asks more. If beauty can be found in bodies, it can be found in souls, in the particular way a mind moves, in the quality of a person's attention, in the shape of a character that has been formed by honest examination over years. And the beauty of a soul, Diotima tells him, is worth more than the beauty of any body, because the soul can hold beauty as its own, can grow toward it, can be changed by it in a way a body cannot. The person climbing the ladder finds that they can love a beautiful mind with a clarity they could not quite achieve with a beautiful form, because the mind's beauty does not shift with the light or diminish with time in the same way, and it offers something back, a contact, a recognition, an exchange that the beauty of surfaces alone does not permit. Higher still, the ladder leads toward beautiful practices and beautiful laws, the work of human communities striving toward justice and order, and beyond these toward the beauty of knowledge itself, the forms of understanding that have been shaped by long and honest inquiry. The person ascending this ladder is not leaving beauty behind at each step, They are finding it in wider and wider forms. Each rung is a larger house for the same light. And then, at the top, not earned by cleverness or by force, but arrived at after the long patient climb, there is the vision Deutema describes in language that slows down, that becomes careful in a way her earlier language was not, because she is trying to say something the language was not built to hold. The vision is of beauty itself, not beautiful things, not beautiful bodies or beautiful souls or beautiful forms of knowledge. Beauty itself, absolute, pure, unchanging, the thing that all beautiful things are beautiful by sharing in, the source of what shines through every particular face and every particular idea that has ever caught and held a person's attention. Socrates, reporting this to the gathered guests, did not say he had reached the top of the ladder. He said only that Deutema had shown him the way, had described to him where the ascent led, and that this description had changed the way he saw everything below it. The beauty he had encountered in his life, in the faces of young people who interested him, in the arguments of philosophers who had found something true, in the order of well-reasoned thought, all of it was now seen against a background that gave it a different weight. Not more precious, but more transparent, more like a window and less like a wall. Outside the house, the city of Athens continued through the night. The Parthenon stood on the hill above it, lit by whatever moon there was. Somewhere in the streets, other conversations were happening, other cups were being filled. Socrates sat in the lamplight and went on speaking, and his voice in the account that survives has the quality of someone who has not quite finished thinking, who is following a thought, still in motion, who is not trying to close the question, but to hold it open long enough for the people in the room to feel what he had felt when the question was first put to him. There is a moment in the myth Plato sets in the Phaedrus that connects to this, though the vocabulary is different and the setting is not a dinner party, but the open air beside a river on a warm afternoon. Socrates is speaking, already deep into the account of the soul's celestial journey, the procession of souls through the heavens, following the gods above the visible sphere, toward the rim that separates the ordered cosmos from what lies beyond it. And in this account, beauty plays a role unlike the one it plays anywhere else in the dialogues. It becomes the principle by which the ascent is possible at all. The other forms, Socrates says in the Phaedrus, cannot be easily reached from where the soul finds itself after incarnation. Justice itself, wisdom itself, the form of the good, these are not available to the embodied soul through direct perception. The body's senses open only onto the world of particular changing things, and the forms that correspond to justice and wisdom do not announce themselves through sight or hearing or touch. To reach them requires argument, sustained and careful, and argument is slow, and not everyone can follow it all the way. But beauty is different. Beauty has what Plato calls the clearest visible appearance. It shines through the things of this world with a directness the other forms do not match. The beautiful face, the beautiful body, the particular quality of light on water or on stone, these are not simply pleasant, but luminous, carrying something through from the other side of the visible world. And when the soul that has been incarnated and has forgotten what it once knew directly encounters this earthly beauty, something happens that is not quite perception and not quite memory, but a kind of collision between the two. This is the doctrine Plato calls anamnesis, recollection. The soul does not learn what beauty is by encountering beautiful things. The soul, encountering beautiful things, remembers what beauty is, because it already knew, once in the time before incarnation, when it traveled in the procession and looked out over the rim of heaven at the forms in their unmediated reality. That knowledge did not disappear when the soul entered the body. It went dormant. It went silent. It became the thing inside the person who does not know quite what they are looking for, but recognizes it unmistakably when it appears. The trembling that Plato describes in the Phaedrus, when the soul encounters true beauty, is not simply an aesthetic response. It is recognition. Something that was sleeping in the person is woken by what it sees, and the waking is not calm, because nothing that has been sleeping that long and that deeply can come back to full awareness without some disturbance. The person feels warmth and something close to fear, and beneath the fear, something that might be called relief, the specific relief of a thing that has been trying for a long time to remember something and has just found the edge of it. In the allegory of the chariot, this moment of recognition appears as the wings beginning to grow. The charioteer catches sight of the beloved's face, and through the beloved's face catches a glimpse of the beauty the soul once saw directly above the rim of heaven. And in that glimpse, the entire soul begins to change. The wings, those parts of the soul that were made for ascent, that were in full flower during the celestial journey, and that shed their feathers on the long fall into incarnation and forgetting, begin, slowly and with some discomfort, to push back through. The quills press against the inner surface of the soul. The warmth spreads, and the charioteer, holding the reins with what Plato calls trembling hands, tries to hold the direction of the vision while the dark horse below him is already lunging toward the earth. This is where the two kinds of eros become something more than a neat philosophical distinction. Plato has a name for the first kind, the kind that moves downward, that is satisfied by bodies, that mistakes pleasure for the thing it is actually seeking. He calls it common, or vulgar, meaning not immoral exactly, but misdirected, aimed at a copy when the original is, with patience and with a guide, available. The dark horse in the chariot is this eros in its most immediate form. It sees beauty and it charges. It has no interest in where beauty comes from. It wants what it sees, and it wants it completely, and the wanting is honest in its way. It is real desire, not pretended, but it has no eyes for what it cannot touch. The second kind of eros moves differently. Plato calls it heavenly or divine, not because it is without urgency, but because its urgency is aimed correctly, pointed toward the form, rather than toward the image of the form, toward the source of the light, rather than toward the object the light is falling on. The charioteer straining upward at the rim of heaven is the second eros working at its fullest reach. The charioteer is not cold. The charioteer is not philosophical in the sense of detached. The straining is real. The vision is real. The wings growing in the shoulder blades of the soul are real, and their growth is not comfortable, and is not painless, and is not the same as sitting in a library with a book. It is motion. It is upward motion. And it requires the entire soul, including the dark horse, to be pointed in the right direction before it can be sustained. What Plato is doing in the Phaedrus that he does not quite do anywhere else is insisting that this eros, the heavenly kind, the philosophical kind, is not the calm opposite of desire. It is desire, purified and redirected. The charioteer does not work without the horses. The wings do not grow without the vision of beauty that triggers the recollection. The philosopher does not ascend through pure logic alone, following argument in the abstract with no bodily involvement, no trembling, no warmth, no particular face that first arrested and turned them. The ascent begins in the senses. It begins in the body's encounter with beauty that the body cannot hold. It begins in the very thing that the dark horse charges toward, except that the charioteer understands, and the dark horse does not, that what makes the face beautiful is not the face. This is a delicate position, and Plato holds it carefully. He is not saying that bodies do not matter, or that the love of particular people is always a mistake to be outgrown. He is saying that the love of particular people, held with philosophical attention, can be the beginning of something that moves far beyond its starting point, without ever quite leaving it. The beloved face does not disappear from the picture. It becomes a kind of window, permanently installed in the soul of the person who has loved and been changed by loving, through which the larger light continues to arrive. There is a passage near the center of the Phaedrus myth that is unlike anything else in the dialogues, and it is worth dwelling in it for a moment before moving on. Plato describes what happens when two people are caught in this mutual encounter with beauty. The lover who sees in the beloved's face the reflection of the divine beauty the soul once knew, and the beloved who, looking back into the lover's adoring eyes, sees something return to them that they did not know they contained. The beloved receives the lover's gaze and finds in it an image of their own divinity, a reflection of what they actually are beneath the surface of what they appear to be, returned to them by someone who has looked more carefully and with more love than they have looked at themselves. Both people in this account are being drawn toward the same source. The lover is drawn by what shines through the beloved. The beloved is drawn by what they see of themselves in the lover's eyes, which is the same light, differently angled. And the result, if the philosophical work is done honestly, if the love is guided rather than merely indulged, is not that either person is left behind, or that the love dissolves into pure abstraction. The result is that both are lifted, both are moved, both begin, in each other's company, to grow the wings the soul needs for the ascent that it has always been, in some sense, aiming at. Plato calls this shared philosophical awakening a kind of madness, and he means it as a compliment. The word he uses, mania, is not the madness of disorder or disease. It is the madness of possession by something larger than the ordinary self, the state in which a person has been reached by something divine and is no longer fully contained by their daily habits and daily preoccupations. The lover in this state is not dysfunctional. They are, in Plato's view, more themselves than they were before, more fully alive to what the soul is actually oriented toward, more willing to give up the minor consolations of the appetitive life for the specific warmth that comes from having caught a glimpse, however briefly and indirectly, of what the soul was made to see. There is something in this account that asks to be held lightly, that asks not to be pressed into a system before it has been fully felt. The philosophical argument is there. The forms are real. The soul has pre-existed. Beauty is the clearest earthly trace of the transcendent world. All of that is in the text, and it holds together with a consistency that has kept philosophers returning to it across many centuries. But beneath the argument is something else, something that the myth carries better than the argument does, and it is this: the experience of being arrested by beauty is not a distraction from philosophical life. It is, for Plato, the entry point. The person who has never been stopped by a beautiful face, never felt the specific quality of recognition that beauty produces, never known the warmth that Plato is describing when he talks about the wings beginning to press against the inside of the soul, that person is not further along the ladder than the one who has been stopped. That person may not have yet found their way to the first rung. The body's encounter with beauty, honestly attended to, honestly followed wherever it leads, is already philosophy, not yet the most advanced philosophy, but the beginning, the necessary and genuine beginning of the same inquiry that carries all the way to the top of Diotima's ladder and to the charioteer's trembling vision at the rim of the heavens. There is a quality to how Plato writes about beauty in the Phaedrus that is different from how he writes about almost anything else. The arguments in the Republic and the Phaedo are carefully marshaled and defended, each step built on the last, the logic moving forward with the controlled deliberateness of someone who knows where they are going and is determined to take the reader with them. But in the Phaedrus, when the topic turns to Eros and beauty and the wings beginning to grow, the prose opens up. It becomes less guarded. The sentences reach further and hold more than they can quite contain, and the strain is not a failure, but a quality, the quality of language that is trying to say something it knows is at the edge of what language can reach. This is one of the reasons the Phaedo is among the most unusual of the dialogues. It begins as a debate about rhetoric, and then finds itself in the middle of a cosmology of the soul that no one had quite asked for. And the pivot happens through a myth, through the image of the chariot, through the specific vocabulary of love and beauty, that rhetoric, mere rhetoric, the kind the sophists practiced, was never capable of holding. Plato is not simply illustrating a philosophical point with a pretty story. He is making the claim that some things can only be approached this way, through image and myth and the specific quality of attention that beauty demands, and that approaching them any other way would miss the very thing they are made of. The wings and the soul are not a metaphor Plato uses and then quietly sets aside. They recur. They appear in the Phaedo at the moment of recognition, growing painfully and warmly back into existence as the soul remembers what they were made for. They appear in the context of the lover who has been arrested by beauty and is now, for the first time in a long time, feeling the pull of the ascent in a way that is physical and not merely intellectual. And they appear again at the end of the myth, when Plato speaks of souls that have made sufficient philosophical progress in their lives, that have governed the chariot with sufficient wisdom and care, being rewarded at death not with further cycles of descent, but with the beginning of a genuine return. Wings fully grown, the ascent no longer a struggle, but a homecoming. The forms no longer glimpsed at a distance, but approached directly, at last, as the soul always carried within itself the capacity to approach them. But that is not quite the image to rest in tonight. Not the soul arrived, not the ascent completed, not the full vision of beauty received in its unmixed and absolute form. The image to rest in is the earlier one, the one that happens in an afternoon beside a river, or in an evening in a philosopher's house, or in whatever ordinary moment of a life when the person looks at something or someone and feels unmistakably that the beauty they are encountering is not finally a property of the thing they are looking at, but a light they are beginning to remember. The charioteer in the Phaedrus myth does not arrive at the top, not in the version Plato tells. The dark horse pulls, the chariot dips and recovers. The noble horse strains, and the charioteer holds the reins with hands that are not steady and does not look away. And in the struggling, in the holding, in the refusal to let the chariot be pulled entirely downward by the part of the soul that wants only what it can touch, in all of that, the wings go on growing. Not quickly, not without difficulty, not in a single vision that answers everything and settles everything and returns the soul in one uninterrupted motion to the place it came from, but steadily in the way that things grow when the conditions are honestly attended to, when the philosopher keeps returning to the practice, keeps following the beauty that arrests them toward its source, keeps sitting with Diotima's ladder and placing one foot above the other, rung by rung, in the direction that the longing itself has always been pointing. Diotima told Socrates that Eros is always in a state of poverty, and always in a state of seeking. She told him that this is not a defect but a nature, the nature of something that is genuinely alive, genuinely in motion, genuinely oriented toward a good it has not yet fully received. The philosopher who sits with this description and finds in it something recognizable is not finding a description of their failure. They are finding a description of what it means to be a soul, still moving toward the truth, which is not a lesser thing than having arrived. It may be, in some sense, the only form of the journey that is actually available to a person in a body, on an afternoon beside a river, with their sandals off, and the water cold around their feet, and the plane trees shade deep above them, and the whole long question of what love is, and what beauty is, and what the soul is, made of just beginning to open. The longing for beauty and the longing for truth are not, in Plato's account, separate longings, wearing similar clothes. They are the same longing. One name for it is eros, another name for it is philosophy. Both names point toward the same motion in the soul, upward toward the source, toward the light that ordinary beautiful things conduct without producing, toward the vision at the rim of heaven that the charioteer strains toward with trembling hands and growing wings, recognizing in that vision not something new, but something the soul has always already known, pressing now, warm and unmistakable, against the inner edges of itself. On the last morning of his life, Socrates sat on the edge of a narrow prison bed and held out his legs toward the man who had come to remove his chains. The iron had been there for some time. As it was lifted free, he pressed his fingers against the place where the weight had rested, and he remarked to the friends gathered in the cell that pain and pleasure were strange neighbors, that wherever one had been, the other came quietly afterward, as if the two could not help but follow each other through the world. His friends laughed a little, the way people laugh when they are not sure if they are allowed to. Socrates was calm in a way that none of them could quite account for. He had always been calm, but this morning, the calm was different. It had a kind of completion to it, a settled quality, as though something that had been building for 70 years had finally arrived at the condition it had always been moving toward. The friends in that room were not philosophers in the public sense. They were people who had walked with Socrates, sat with him, argued beside him in the streets and the gymnasiums and the shaded porticos of Athens. They had listened to him for years, and now they were watching him face the end of his life with the same unhurried attention he had given to every question about the soul, about justice, about what it meant to live well. The sight of it troubled them more than they could say, not because Socrates seemed afraid, he did not, but because his composure, on a morning when composure seemed impossible, pointed at something they could not easily put down. He had been thinking about the soul for a long time, not in the abstract way of a man who had chosen an interesting subject, but in the way of someone who had decided, early and without fanfare, that the soul was the only thing worth attending to, that every question about how to live, every argument about justice and courage and wisdom, had the soul as its true subject. And now, with the hours narrowing toward the one thing no argument could stop, he sat on his bed and began to speak about it again. His friends listened. The light came in at the window at the angle morning light takes in, early spring. Socrates spoke, and what he said was this, that a philosopher, in some sense, had been practicing for death the whole of his life, that this was not morbid, that it was, in fact, the most reasonable thing a careful person could do. The claim wants some unpacking, and Socrates was patient enough to give it. The soul, as he understood it, was not at home in the body. It was present in the body, bound to it, shaped by its appetites and pleasures and pains, pulled constantly toward the things the body desired, but it was not native to it. It came from somewhere else, or pointed towards something else, or both. And the work of philosophy, as Socrates had always practiced it, was the gradual and patient disentangling of the soul from those attachments. Not violently, not through the kind of harsh asceticism that produces only a different kind of enslavement to the body, but through the slow cultivation of attention toward what was eternal rather than what was temporary, toward what was true rather than what was merely pleasing. Death, in that light, was not an ending. It was the moment the disentangling became complete. The body fell away, and the soul, if it had been properly tended, continued on, not stumbling into the dark, but moving, as it had always been moving, toward the things it had spent a lifetime learning to love. This was not the resigned comfort of a man making peace with something he could not avoid. It was an argument, carefully made, from a man who had spent decades thinking about what the soul was and what it needed. The composure in that room on that morning came from the argument being held. It was not separate from the thinking. It was the thinking lived all the way through. The argument for why the soul does not end came in several forms across the dialogues Plato wrote, and each form reaches toward the same conclusion from a different angle. In the Phaedrus, the approach is through motion itself. The soul is defined there, not as a thing that moves, but as the moving, as that which is the source of its own motion, the originating cause from which all other movement in the world ultimately flows. And if that is what the soul is, if it is not moved from outside, but moves itself, is the very principle of self-movement, then it can have no beginning and no end, because to begin would mean it was caused by something before it, and to end would mean something after it went on without it. But nothing goes on without it. Everything that moves, moves because the soul is the ground of all motion. It is prior to the world, in a sense, and will be present when the world as we know it has changed entirely. This is not an easy thing to hold in the mind, and Socrates was under no illusion that it would settle immediately. The image that helps is not of a thing moving, but of moving itself, not a river, but the force that makes rivers possible, not a star crossing the sky, but whatever it is that keeps the sky turning, something that cannot stop, because stopping would mean ceasing to be what it is. A source cannot run dry without ceasing to be a source. The soul, in the Phaedrus account, is not something that has motion. It is something that is motion, and what is motion cannot be stilled. In the Phaedo, the approach is different. There Plato turns to the structure of opposites, to the way the world seems always to move between paired conditions, one giving way to the other in a cycle that has no obvious terminus. Sleeping gives way to waking. Waking gives way to sleeping. The larger and the smaller define each other across a continuous exchange, each producing the condition of the other through its own transformation. And if living gives way to dying, as it plainly does, then dying, held inside the same structure, must give way to living again. Death is not an exit from the cycle. It is a point within it, a phase of something ongoing, no more final than sleep is final when morning has always come before. This argument has a quality Plato liked. It works from what is already familiar, rather than from something new. The listener does not need to accept an unfamiliar metaphysics to follow it. They need only to recognize what they already know, that things change, and that change almost never moves in one direction only. The seed becomes the plant, and the plant returns to the earth, and from that earth the seed again. Not the same seed, not the same plant, but the pattern holds. And if the soul is part of that pattern, if it too moves between states rather than arriving once and stopping, then death is not what it first appears to be from the outside, looking in. The doctrine of metempsychosis, the soul's movement through successive lives, is something Plato drew in part from the Pythagorean philosophers he encountered on his travels in southern Italy, and he carried it home and worked it into the fabric of several dialogues without ever quite systematizing it, as though it were something better held loosely than pinned. The basic shape of it is this: the kind of soul a person has cultivated during life shapes the kind of life available to it afterward, not as punishment assigned from outside, but as consequence arising from within, the soul finding its way toward the conditions that match what it has most deeply become. A soul that has lived entirely in the service of appetite, that has spent its incarnate life chasing pleasure and avoiding pain, will find itself drawn toward conditions that resemble that kind of life. A soul that has spent its time in the slow work of turning toward the forms, toward the good, toward beauty, toward wisdom, will find itself drawn upward toward something lighter. The choice, in Plato's telling, is not made for the soul by some external judge. The soul makes it itself from what it is. This is the deep urgency at the heart of the doctrine, that the examined life is not merely better in the way that a well-ordered day is better than a chaotic one. It is better in a way that extends across a span of time so large that the span of a single human life, looked at from inside it, can barely register as a fraction of what is at stake. What a person values, what they train themselves to love, what they practice attending to, all of this persists in the soul and shapes what comes next. The stakes of philosophy, in this account, are not academic. At the end of the Republic, Plato gathers all of this into the myth of was a soldier who died in battle, and before he could be cremated, woke again. He had been somewhere in the interval. What he described on his return was a place of extraordinary order and strange freedom, a meadow where souls arrived from two directions, some from below the earth and some descending from above the heavens, and all of them moving toward a place where the next lives would be chosen. The choosing was the heart of it. Souls were given lots to establish the order of choosing, and then an array of lives was laid before them, all the lives available in the world, and each soul, in its turn, reached forward and took one. The choice was real. It was not assigned. The soul selected the life it would enter next. And what Plato notes quietly but with full intention is that the souls who chose worst were often those who had lived best in the previous life, who had come from well-ordered, comfortable conditions and had never been tested, who had never had to think carefully about what they valued or why. They chose quickly without reflection, reaching for what looked most like the pleasure they had known before, not seeing until it was too late the nature of what they had picked up. The souls that chose wisely were often those who had suffered, who had been through enough to know that the outside conditions of a life were not its soul. They chose more slowly. They looked at what was being offered, not for its external glittering, but for the inner character the life would require and produce. The philosophical soul, Plato says, is the one that has learned to look past the surface, in life, in argument, in the choice of what to love, and that skill turns out to matter infinitely in the meadow where lives are chosen. The spindle of necessity stood at the center of the myth, a great column of light stretching through the sky and the earth, turning the nested spheres of the heavens around it. On the lip of each sphere, a siren sang a single note, and together the 8 notes made a harmony no one in a body could hear clearly. Around the spindle sat the 3 fates, Lachesis, Clotho, Atropos, who drew out the thread of each chosen life, spun it into being, and at the appointed time cut it. They worked without hurry. They worked without partiality. The threads passed through their hands with the same steady pace, regardless of what was woven into them. Plato gives this image without a great deal of comment, as though the image itself is doing more work than argument could do. The spindle turning, the fates working, the souls in the meadow choosing with the degrees of wisdom or foolishness their lives had built into them. It is a picture of a cosmos in which nothing is wasted and nothing is arbitrary, in which the long work of becoming what one is has consequences that run forward into futures no single life can see. It is not a picture of justice as reward and punishment distributed by a judge. It is a picture of justice as the structure of things, as the way the cosmos actually works, beneath and behind the surface, where shorter-term accounting is done. On the morning in the prison, with his chains removed and his friends around him, Socrates did not rehearse the myth of air. He had told it before. What he did instead was something simpler and in some ways more affecting. He talked about what the philosophical life had actually been, not as a doctrine, but as a practice, as something a person does day after day in the ordinary conditions of an ordinary life until it becomes what they are. The practice was this: to attend to the soul rather than to the body, to turn toward the forms, toward the permanent shapes of justice and beauty and goodness that lay behind the changing world, rather than toward the shifting satisfactions available through the senses, not in hatred of the body, not in contempt for the pleasures the body offered, but in clear-eyed recognition that those pleasures had a limit, that they always ran out, that the soul chasing them would find itself always one step behind what it had wanted. The philosophical life was not a renunciation, it was a reorientation, a slow turning of attention, maintained and deepened through years, toward what the soul had always been drawn toward beneath the noise of appetite. What Socrates described on his last morning was that this turning, practiced over a lifetime, produced something in the soul, not mastery, not a rival, but a genuine familiarity with the direction, a sense of the forms, not as distant, difficult abstractions, but as things the soul had been moving toward long enough to recognize them, distantly, imperfectly, the way one recognizes a landscape seen before in a different light, but recognizes it nonetheless. And what death would do, in his account, was simply to remove the last of the obstructions. The body, which had always been pulling in its own direction, would fall away, and the soul would continue, without that weight, without that drag, in the direction it had been practicing for years. This is why the philosopher does not fear death, in Socrates' telling, not because death has been proven to be nothing, or because the soul has been proven to survive it. The arguments he offers are careful, and they are real, but they are arguments, and Socrates himself acknowledges they are not the kind of certainty that closes inquiry. The philosopher does not fear death because the soul has been moving all along in the direction death reveals. It has been practicing, and what is practiced deeply enough becomes eventually what the soul simply is. Among the things the soul has been practicing in the account spread across the Phaedo and the Phaedrus is the recovery of what it once knew. The doctrine of anamnesis recollection runs through Plato's understanding of the soul, like a thread pulled tight, and on the morning of Socrates' death, it gives the philosophical life a particular kind of depth. Before incarnation, the soul traveled. It moved in the retinue of the gods through the heavens, and it glimpsed the forms in their unmediated reality, beauty itself, justice itself, the good itself, before the weight of embodiment came down, and the veil of forgetting settled over everything it had seen. Nothing is entirely lost. This is the claim, The forgetting is real, but it is not total, and it is not permanent. Every genuine insight in the philosophical life is not a discovery of something new, but a recovery of something old, the soul recognizing, through the fog of its incarnate condition, something it always already knew. The work of philosophy is not construction, it is excavation. The philosopher is not building a knowledge they did not have. They are uncovering a knowledge they had before the body came and covered it over. This changes the quality of what philosophizing feels like, at least in Plato's telling. The moment of genuine understanding, when an argument lands and the soul recognizes it as true, has the texture not of arrival at something new, but of return to something familiar. The word Plato uses is anamnesis, remembering, in the sense of gathering back together what was scattered, bringing again into the present what was present before and lost. The philosophical life is a life of recollecting. The soul, in its patient daily turning toward the forms, is slowly reconstructing the vision it had before it fell into time. And this is where the charioteer returns at the end of the long arc of Plato's thinking about the soul. In the Phaedrus, the wings of the soul are what made the pre-incarnate journey possible. The paired wings that lifted the soul chariot through the heavens, letting it ride along the rim and glimpse the eternal forms stretched out beyond it. When the soul fell into incarnation, the wings were lost, or not lost, diminished, collapsed down to something vestigial, a potential that waited in the soul, rather than a power active in it. And what the philosophical life does, across the Phaedo's account and the Phaedrus's myth and the Republic's long argument about justice and the soul, is slowly regrow those wings. The growing is not always visible. It does not happen in a single moment or through a single argument. It happens the way things that are genuinely alive happen, gradually, through sustained nourishment, through repeated orientation toward the light. Every act of genuine contemplation feeds the wing. Every choice of the true over the convenient, the beautiful over the merely pleasant, the examined over the assumed. All of this is nourishment. The wings grow without the soul, always knowing they are growing. The philosopher on an ordinary afternoon, working through a problem quietly in an olive grove, is not aware of the lengthening, but it is happening. Socrates seems to have known this about his own life, not with the certainty of a man who has verified it, but with the settled confidence of someone who has attended carefully enough to the interior of his own experience to trust what he has found there. He had spent 50 years or more in the company of questions about the soul. He had watched himself closely. He had, by his own account, learned to hear the difference between the part of him that wanted to be comfortable and the part of him that wanted to be true, and he had, over a very long time, learned to follow the second more reliably than the first. Not perfectly, not without failure, but persistently and with increasing clarity about what the difference between them felt like from the inside. On the morning of his death, sitting on the bed with his chains removed and his friends around him, he had the quality of a man whose wings had been growing for a long time. He did not claim to know what came next. He offered arguments, the argument from self-motion, the argument from opposites, the account of the soul's pre-existence and its long journey, but he offered them as the best available reasoning, not as the closed and final word. The inquiry remained open. It always had. What had changed was not the certainty of the conclusion, but the quality of the person holding it, the depth of a life spent in the direction of what was true. His friends wept as the conversation went on. Socrates noticed, and he gently chided them, not unkindly, but with the specific kind of attention He had always given to the difference between what was useful and what was merely felt. The tears were understandable. They came from love and from the particular human pain of watching someone irreplaceable move toward an edge. But the tears were also, in a quiet way, a vote of no confidence in everything Socrates had spent his life arguing, an implicit claim that what was about to happen was a defeat, and Socrates did not believe it was a defeat. He believed it was the completion of a direction he had been walking for decades, the last step in a journey that had been underway since the first morning he stood in the agora and asked his first honest question about what it meant to live well. The cup was brought in the late afternoon. The friends had lost track of how long they had been talking. The light in the room had moved from one wall to another. The way light moves in a room where people are gathered around something important. Socrates took the cup with the same quality he had brought to everything that morning, unhurried, attentive, in full possession of himself. He said what he needed to say. Then he drank. What Plato records of this moment is not the moment of death itself. It is the quality of the living up to it. The way a man can spend so long moving towards something that when it arrives it has already, in some sense, been completed. The philosophical life, Plato says across all these dialogues, is not a preparation for something that comes later. It is itself the practice of the thing it points toward, the soul already in motion toward the forms, already turning away from what is merely temporary, already in the process of the long recollection that constitutes genuine knowledge. The wings in the Phaedrus are what make the soul capable of that turning. In the souls of most people, they lie dormant, pressed flat by the weight of habit and appetite, and the ordinary business of a life that has not yet begun to ask what it is for. In the soul of the philosopher, they grow slowly, fed by each genuine encounter with beauty and truth, and the careful work of thinking one honest thought at a time. They are not fully grown in any one life. Plato is careful about this. The journey is long, and the regrowing takes more than one incarnation completes, but they are growing. They are always, in the philosophical soul, growing. What the wings make possible, in the end, is not escape from the world, but a different relationship to it. The soul with wings is not above the changing world in the sense of being removed from it. It is above it in the sense of being able to see it whole, to see the beautiful face as the light shining through it from the form of beauty, to see the just act as the form of justice pressing through the limited conditions of a particular human situation. The winged soul does not leave the world behind. It carries the world differently, with a grip that is at once more careful and less clutching, because it knows, in the bone-deep way that only practice over time produces, that what it loves most in the world is a reflection of something it is always moving toward. The philosopher on his last morning had this not perfectly. The arguments he offered his friends were still arguments, still the products of a mind working at the edge of what it could see, still pointing at something that lay just beyond the range of what any reasoning from inside a body could fully reach. But the direction was clear. The direction had always been clear, and what the morning of death made available, in Plato's telling, was not revelation, not the sudden disclosure of what had been hidden, but the culmination of a direction so long maintained that its continuation beyond the body felt less like a crossing into the unknown than like the soul finally free to go where it had always been going. There is a quietness to this that Plato earns. It does not demand assent. It does not require the reader to believe in wings, or in forms, or in the pre-existence of the soul, to feel the weight of what is being said. What is being said is something simpler, beneath all the metaphysics, that a life genuinely given to the care of the soul to the patient turning toward what is true and good and beautiful, produces something in the soul that persists and deepens and goes on producing. That the direction matters more than the destination, that the practicing is itself the arriving. The soul, in Plato's long account of it, is not a thing waiting to be saved from time. It is a thing that moves through time in a particular direction, and the quality of its movement, the steadiness of its orientation, the depth of its recollection, the health of its internal accord between the parts that desire and the part that guides, is what constitutes its life, not its biographical life, the years and events and relationships that make up a human story, but its philosophical life, the ongoing work of becoming what it most deeply is. The wings in the Phaedrus are not a metaphor for success. They are a metaphor for the soul's constitutive direction, upward, toward the rim of heaven, where the forms shine in their undimmed reality, toward the beauty the charioteer caught a glimpse of before the dark horse pulled the chariot earthward again. The wings grow not because the soul achieves anything in the ordinary sense, but because the soul keeps turning, because after every fall, after every earthward lunge of the part that wants what is immediate and near, the charioteer takes up the reins again, steadies, lifts, turns once more in the direction of the light. Socrates drank his cup and lay down, and the feeling moved from his feet upward through his body, and he drew the cover over himself. His friends sat with him in the quiet of the room. The light had gone from the window, or nearly gone. One of his friends asked if there was anything he wanted to say. Socrates, it seems, did not answer. He was already in some sense elsewhere, not gone, but no longer fully present in the way a person is present when they are still contending with their body. He lay still. Then he was still in the other way. His friends kept sitting in the room for a while, because there was nowhere else to be. The question Socrates had spent his life asking was not answered by his dying. It was not supposed to be. Philosophy, he had always said, was not the kind of inquiry that ends. It continues through those who follow the practice, who take up the questions, who sit down in their own time and ask honestly what the soul is and what it needs and what it is moving toward. The arguments he left behind were not conclusions. They were the best available maps of a territory that does not fully yield to maps, which is perhaps why Plato wrote them as dialogues, as conversations that pause but do not close, as thinking in motion rather than thinking arrived. Outside the prison that evening, the city of Athens went on in its usual way. The agoras were emptying, fires were being lit in the houses.